Welcome back to Strange Exiles, a podcast about ideas, identity, and ideology. I am Bram E. Gieben, an author, critic, and musician with a passion for philosophy, art, and culture. Today, I'm going to speak to Clare Follmann, an author and environmentalist whose writing engages with themes of landscape, ecology, climate crisis, language, and philosophy. Her latest book is Scapegoat: What the Invasive Species Story Gets Wrong, recently published by AK Press. And this book, it's fair to say, is a very provocative read in which Clare recounts the stories of people, animals, and cultures that have too often been cast aside or minimized in the narrative about invasive species and the climate crisis that we're going through. Clare imagines in the book what it might take for us to reach a post-capitalist society that prioritizes the well-being of people and planet. Clare, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Oh, it's excellent to see you, and yeah, I really enjoyed the book. It was a fantastic read. Just drew together so many ideas about language, about how we imagine the natural world versus the human world. So it unpacked some really intriguing themes. Very much enjoyed it.
I'm so
Uh,
glad.
so yeah, we're going to talk today about your book, Scapegoat. And as I say, that's with AK Press. It's out now. You can go and order a copy online and have that sent straight to you. You can also find out more about Clare's work at her website, clarefollmann.com. If I just switch to that tab, we will see Clare's lovely website, which has a beautiful woodcut. I was going to ask you about the woodcut, actually. Was that some of your work?
Yeah, I did that. It was kind of honestly, I just kind of threw it together one day. I had gotten a tablet or an iPad, I guess, and I was drawing on it, and then I made that, and it was actually published in a magazine. But I was kind of trying to figure out some art to put on my website, and I thought this seemed relevant to both my current book and a future book I'm working on.
Excellent, excellent. Well, hopefully we'll get a little bit of space at the end of the show to ask you about your next book as well. For now, though, let's kind of dive into the topics you're exploring in Scapegoat. I wanted to ask, first of all, what kind of is your background as a writer and researcher? I'm interested to find out like what led you to write this particular book.
Yeah. So I mean, I've been writing all my life. Would always carry a notebook with me, and I wrote always as a child growing up. But particularly for this book, and this sort of depth of research and writing, I got my master's degree in environmental studies, at Evergreen State College, which is a local college where I live. And it was actually in a prerequisite class for in pursuit of my master's degree, that I really started getting interested in exploring the topic and the history and then the problems that I see in invasive species management. We had this class on, it was a class on forest ecology, and we had this guest speaker. It was actually like 10 years ago last month, actually. We had this guest speaker come in. His name was Lowell Diller, and he was telling us about the work he was doing, which at the time involved killing barred owls to try to save spotted owls in the Pacific Northwest. And some context. So barred owls are considered invasive in the Pacific Northwest where I live. They are native to the eastern side of the country, and they theoretically like moved here, following the path of colonizers as colonizers colonized the continent. Colonizers violently suppressed indigenous cultural practices, including controlled burning. They extirpated beaver and bison, and this created two routes for the barred owl to move west. It allowed the boreal forests of Canada to grow, and it created these like pockmarked little green oases in the Great Plains that allowed barred owls to sort of piggyback over to the Pacific Northwest. Where around the same time, spotted owls were also facing side effects of colonization. Logging was severely impacting spotted owl habitat. These are birds that need to fly on a range between 1,000 and 4,000 acres, and they prefer old growth forests. So obviously, logging was not ideal for this species survival. And then when the barred owl came, because the spotted owl was already experiencing population decline. The barred owl, which can eat more than the spotted owl, can live in more places than the spotted owl, but also live in the places where spotted owl live and eat what the spotted owl eats. The barred owl is better suited to survival out here, and spotted owl is experiencing population decline that is compounded by the presence of the barred owl. So all that to say, Lowell Diller at this time was exploring this experiment to see if killing 3,000 barred owls would support spotted owl population in the Pacific Northwest. And it was like, I don't know, I was like listening to this story and it was really captivating, really brutal, because you have to play these like barred owl mating calls and then they'll come out and then they get shot. And it's just, it's pretty horrifying display of invasive species management. I'd never heard of anything quite that brutal at the time. And then the way Lowell Diller was talking about it, he was distraught to be doing this form of invasive species management. He hated killing these owls. He loved owls. He grew up in his career to revere raptors and revere owls, and now his job required him to also kill them. And so it was really his anguish at having to do this brutal form of invasive species management that went against his own values that got me curious about it. He also said at one time, he said, I hate to do it. It's awful, but this is the best plan we have available to supporting spotted owl population, to saving the spotted owls. And so I was like, well, I don't know, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but what if it's not the best plan? What other plans could there be? And so that's really what started my interest in the topic. And if you read my book, you'll find a lot of plot holes with the barred owl as main threat to spotted owl population. I did a lot of digging into that particular invasive species management project and found a lot of issues. Maybe I'll talk about that later. But anyway, yeah, that's kind of what got me interested in the topic.
That's so interesting that even for the people who are responsible for coming up with these plans and managing them, there's kind of, I guess, an internal struggle with the contradiction of wanting to save one animal by killing another, particularly kind of in great numbers. Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, one of the things your book aims to sort of problematize is this notion of native versus invasive,
Mhm.
and you explore that through the language, but also through some specific examples of species being considered one or the other. How do you think these terms have become less useful in the last few decades? Were they ever a good way of framing this?
It's complicated because there are really two sides. I am problematizing these terms, but I do recognize, that sometimes these terms have value to a degree in preserving habitat. But I think it's really important to focus on the problems, to not get carried away with the binary that these two terms to enforce, combined with the sort of militaristic war metaphor embedded in invasive species that makes it just like this binary so much more militaristic, more war, more us versus them, more villainizing of a particular species. So, but yeah, like invasive, for example, this is the word we use to describe this particular species that we don't want here, that are interfering with native habitats, that are, causing all sorts of issues. That's the story. They're an invading villainistic enemy. But the definition is there's problems in the definition. The definition I use is the U.S. specific definition. There are other definitions, but they all get at the same sort of thing and have the same sort of vocabulary and words, and also problems. So the definition that I use, I know it by heart. It goes. Invasive species are non-native species whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic harm, harm to the environment, or harm to human health. So I think at first blush, you can see some issues with that. First of all, the word harm, very subjective. Harm to one thing can be beneficial to another thing, or not harmful, at the very least to another thing. Subjective word. It's also a plastic word, which I can talk about later. It's a very vague word, and the definition of this word is slippery, and as I said, highly subjective. The other issue that I see very obviously in this definition is you've got the first type of harm they describe is economic harm. So you've got this already very blatant capitalist priority in describing a particular species. If this species is causing harm to the economy, then it could be an invasive species. And so I think that's not, very ecologically sound. And so that I think does problematize the idea of an invasive species. And then you have also got this like funny little word play here where it's like this species causes or is likely to cause harm. So you've got this like possibility. It might not even cause harm, but it is likely. There's probability that it will cause harm. And so if you take all that together, an invasive species a species could be defined as invasive if it just might decrease property value, and so yeah, anyway, so I think the definition of invasive and how we are defining these species can be problematic, capitalistically biased, and not very ecologically sound. And obviously, in the last few decades, climate crisis and the reality of climate refugee species also severely complicates this binary because as climate crisis rages and as regions and habitats shift and alter under the pressures of climate crisis and change, species that were considered native in certain regions are no longer going to survive as well in those regions. And so you've got this like movement of species that species have always moved. Migration is natural migration is a natural phenomenon of the world, and ecosystems are always changing, but not to this degree of severity. And this is a new phenomenon that we're experiencing where climate refugee species are going to be, and climate crisis is just going to be completely complicating what is native, what is considered native, and what is considered invasive in an ecosystem. And then I think the term native, it's complicated too, for sure. The further back in time you go, the less relevant that term really is. We don't have a lot of historical evidence to like definitively prove the nativity of a specific species. I found out recently this sort of interesting example. I was studying, there was an invasive species management project in some mountain ranges near where I live. These mountain goats in the Olympics weren't supposed to be in the Olympics. They're considered invasive in the Olympics, but they're native in the Cascade mountain range. And so they were either shot in the Olympics or also moved. Some were shot, some were moved to the Cascades. And ultimately, it was kind of a failed experiment because the Cascade mountain goats had already been experiencing population decline. So they thought moving some of these goats over to this mountain range would help support the population. They didn't. Most of those goats died. It was a sort of failed experiment, but it was all predicated on the belief that these goats were invasive to the Olympics. And yet there is historical anecdotal evidence of or anecdotal stories of early settlers who say that they noticed mountain goats in the Olympic region. So, a lot of, I think it's an interesting story that might complicate other invasive species management projects. Like you don't necessarily really know for sure if the species is invasive or native in certain cases. I think in other cases you can know more better, which isn't to say necessarily that the removal of the invasive species is going to always be beneficial to the environment, but it is just very complicated. And at the same time, I just really want to make it clear that like certain plants and animals can contribute to ecological damage and disrupt balance of ecosystems. I'm not denying that. But what I'm getting at is, the names that we use to describe them is complicated. The methods we use to eradicate, what we perceive as invasive are problematic in many cases. And by and large, I talk about this in my book, the passenger driver metaphor. Which gets at the idea that by and large, invasive species are actually not causing ecological damage, but are rather arriving in the wake of pre-existing ecological damage, which is often caused by side effects of capitalist industry and development. So anyway, so yeah, it is complicated. It's not just, there's no such thing as native or invasive, or native and invasive is the only way you should view these ecosystems. Now, I think you really have to unpack and understand all these layers that go into this story that communicates this, what I think is an outdated perspective around invasive species.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you for that. I think it's a little bit about how these terms are used to frame things, and in doing so, sort of flatten the conversation about this. Um, and I guess there's a certain amount of arbitrariness to the words themselves and how they're interpreted. But it
Mhm,
also sort of it's a narrative that sort of implies that there was some sort of Edenic, perfect equilibrium state beforehand,
mhm,
and then what changed was a new species arrived. But like you say, a lot of that ties into you know, human interactions with the environment that have caused the animals to move or to arrive.
mhm.
um, I mean, you use the term anthropogenic. Sorry, I'm going to get this right. You use the term anthropogenic to describe the human-driven actions and interactions with the natural world that might cause this sort of like false battle between invasive and native. What are like the hard limits on what the term anthropogenic describes if we see ourselves as part of nature?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just going back to the word native in terms of species, I found this like interesting phenomenon that happens in the US where a species is considered native if it existed in the United States before colonization. Yeah, that's another thing with invasive. It's like it's so biased and so like so based on subjective desires and interests in species. Like I have a friend who's so anti-invasive species, but they let their cat roam and kill birds and all this, so it's just like it's just so complicated, and
Yeah.
the hypocrisy is rampant, and I think hypocrisy is fascinating and important, but it just does expose, I think this particular hypocrisy does expose like the like issues with invasive.
This term anthropogenic, I really like this because it does sort of sum up, first of all, what an incredible amount of pressure human beings can put on an ecosystem, so it doesn't sort of like undercut the importance of the role of human interaction. But also, it does kind of situate us as part of nature. So I think that's what my kind of question was, what does this term, how far can this term go to describe the kinds of human interactions that can drive what can be termed an invasive species crisis point?
Yeah, the term anthropogenic is interesting. In my book, I really definitely get at like the importance of recognizing that people are part of nature. But I think when I have encountered the term anthropogenic in my research, and in the particular work that I'm interested in looking at, when it's referred to climate crisis or other ecological impacts, it's usually used in a negative way. And I think that does complicate and flatten the picture because obviously, indigenous people have been interfering and engaging with the ecosystem in really beneficial and important ways since time immemorial and currently today. And so I think when the term anthropogenic is used in these sort of negative ways to inspire, like, oh, this is anthropogenic cause, or this is an anthropogenic effect on the habitat. It does flatten the sort of picture that human involvement in the ecosystem is problematized. And I see this like come up as like sort of solutions posed to supporting biodiversity and rebalancing the earth is that, oh, humans have interfered too much. The anthropogenic impact on the world is just too great. And we just need to take a step back. This is our time to take the back seat and let earth heal itself, which I think is a very problematic and perspective. I see why people think this way, but I do think it's problematic because it again like reinforces the human separate from nature idea around the natural world that I think is spurring a lot of the ecological issues that we see today and is predicated on a capitalist society that inspires that sort of separation. Um, I don't think that we should not engage in ecosystem tending, but I think it needs to be done from an anti-capitalist perspective.
Hmm. Your book grapples with a lot of these themes, both the need to evolve beyond capitalism, but also to kind of consider alternatives that we might explore after its collapse. Um, how much kind of faith have you got that some of these ideas are achievable? Do you feel hopeful about it, or do you feel that these are sort of Cassandra type situation where you're making these useful suggestions, but not particularly hopeful that they'll be implemented?
That's so funny that you say that Cassandra. The first cover of my book actually had Cassandra Follmann written because the artist of the book his name was Cassandra, and I guess she didn't have my name, so it was Cassandra Follmann, and I was like, oh, this is so funny. Maybe I'm like Cassandra, and I'm telling all these prophecies that no one's going to believe until. So no, no, actually, I am actually very hopeful. I don't know. I was thinking about this recently. I don't know if this is true, but I kind of think for me, hope is like a choice. I don't know if that's really true, but I am hopeful. Maybe I'm choosing to be hopeful or not, but I do feel like, I don't know. And I don't want to like have this sort of false optimism or talk about like the silver lining that we need to like focus on as like the world succumbs to disaster and inhuman experiences, as climate crisis rages, as in a socioeconomic catastrophe reigns. But at the same time, I do think, we're going to be experiencing a lot of crises in the future. We're already experiencing a lot of crises now. We've been experiencing crises. I think that's going to get worse and worse. And I've, in my research on like crises, research on crises, I found that like in the face of, certain crises, by and large, most often what happens instead of, so it's sort of the capitalist realist perspective where people just become rugged individuals and like hide and battle one another and it's every man for himself. Rather, people come together and they support one another and they take care of each other. And the capitalist priorities of like climbing the corporate ladder or making all the money or like us versus them fade away because we realize how silly they are in the face of these sort of life or death crises. And I think we are going to be experiencing a lot more crises, obviously, over the next few years. And I'm hopeful, I guess, that this will provide the opportunity for us to really cast off the mythologies of capitalist priorities that have been plaguing us and plaguing our connection to the natural world and destroying the natural world. And in my book, I talk about like I don't think it's like we should just rely on the crises and do nothing else. Like, oh, it's going to be fine. We've got all these crises, and we're going to just shut off capitalism, and it's going to be super easy. In my book, I talk about the importance of like prefiguration and dual power, which are like the ideas of like planting the seeds of a new world in the current one to sort of help the transition into a new world that, I talk about a post-capitalist society or a collection of societies that prioritize the well-being of people and planet. I think we do need to be sort of practicing how that would look, engaging in routines and rituals and ways of being that mimic the sort of worlds we want to bring in. And also like really focusing on developing or finding or reclaiming the sort of infrastructure that we'll need to support the transition as well as the new worlds. So I do think it's going to take work, and we need to be preparing like now and planning now and working now towards inviting a better world. But I do think that will be made. That transition will benefit. Maybe is not the best word, but it's what I'm going to say. From the like onslaught of crisis that we're going to experience, that will help destroy, I think, these capitalist mythologies that prevent the new world from being more popularized.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's so interesting. I think like the book that I wrote in 2024 sort of explored that same question of capitalist realism. How do you live in a world to which there is no alternative version? How do you escape capitalism if you can't imagine your way out of it? And I think the conclusion I came to is that that's where the work must begin. That we need to find a way to imagine our way out of it. I think yours is probably a bit more hopeful. It looked at some very promising scenarios. I tried to look at the worst case scenarios,
Yeah.
so we ended up in a different place. But I think we agree on that capitalist realism kind of point.
Yeah.
Um, so you mentioned this earlier. I want to kind of explore it in a bit more depth. One of the most interesting pieces of the book is you write about the use of metaphors in the story told about invasive species, and particularly about plastic words, which can produce rhetoric that sort of conceals ideology at work. And you write about this very convincingly. Um, do you also see this at play in other parts of society and politics, like, for instance, the rhetoric of the far right or the kind of neoliberal center that wants to protect capitalism? Is that where these plastic words originate from, or if you can kind of unpack the concept of plastic words for anyone listening who's not encountered that term?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And first of all, yeah, I want to say, like, when I first started writing this book, it's kind of a niche book, and it's very particular. It's niche. But I did write it as like a case study that could be and the arguments I think that I make in this book, and the conclusions I draw, I think I can be applied beyond the realm of invasive species management in a variety of different disciplines. So I do think, like, the arguments I'm making in this book, the linguistic, the scapegoat arguments, the distraction arguments that I'm making about invasive species, can be applied in a variety of other places as well, for sure. But yeah, so plastic words are words that were born in the vernacular, then adopted by science, and then brought back to the vernacular, stripped of their original meaning, but carrying the sort of aura of science and authority of scientism and of science. And they're words like management, communication, development, strategy, value, resource. There's like 20 odd plastic words. And this like class of words were kind of discovered or found by this German linguist, Uwe Porksen, in the 80s. And he just kind of noticed this like similarity between a few words. He was listening to a speech in Spanish, and he's German, and he was like, wow, there's a bunch of weird words here, and they kind of seem to be getting at the same sort of thing, but they mean different things, but they mean the sort of same thing. So anyway, he wrote this book about it. And that's what I'm citing in my book when I talk about plastic words. And so, yeah, I think plastic words, I mean, I use them, you use them. I think a lot of people use them. They're not like inherently problematic in and of themselves, but when they are used, I think, by certain people, they can be used to sort of hide problematic issues. In recent research, I tried to find an example of this, and I found this sentence that was on a timber company website, and the sentence is like, "We strive to manage these resources sustainably while preserving their economic and environmental and cultural value," or something like that. And so, value, resources, manage, those are plastic words. I would argue sustainably is probably a plastic word at this point too. But it sounds good. It sounds responsible. It's like vague. You don't really know exactly what it means, but it doesn't sound like bad. But the timber company, they are bad. They have failed a bunch of their they failed like 66% of their environmental inspections over the course of like 6 years. They're breaking environmental law. They're contributing to a severe degree of pollution. And so in this case, what I'm trying to get at is that these plastic words provide like really positive, responsible sounding cover for this particular industry to engage in these problematic practices. So I think that that is not unusual. That happens a lot, and this is why we should be wary when we encounter a lot of these jargony plastic words in documents and phrases and speeches on websites.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and I think like it's not just a way of greenwashing,
Hmm.
certain capitalist practices, or making a company that isn't very environmentally sound seem sound. It's
Hmm.
not just that. It's not just you make a convincing case that it's the use of the plastic words freights the need to understand what's being communicated
Hmm.
completely away. You
Hmm.
mentioned scientism, so
Hmm.
these are words that sound businessy or sciency, and so they have almost like I think the term would be truthiness. You
Hmm.
sort of look past those words and assume that that's what they mean. And
Yeah.
you see that absolutely in politics as well. When people are talking about protecting the country's values, that's arguably a plastic word. It struck me, the parts of your book that make the argument that the invasive species narrative mirrors the language of far right politicians describing immigration.
Hmm.
Um, Unpack for me a little bit how these two discourses mirror each other so closely.
Yeah. Yeah. In my book, I have like three quotes that I think convey this really well. One is a quote about Trump, or one is a quote from Trump, one is a quote from Hitler, and one is a quote from some conservationists. And, the Trump and the Hitler quote are both like very bigoted, racist. Quotes that are talking about how people coming into the country are going to poison the blood of the country, right? In Trump it's America, and in Hitler it's Germany. And then the conservationist quote is getting at the idea that the red wolf is an endangered wolf and it is breeding with coyotes. And the breeding of coyotes, which are not native or they're common, is poisoning the genetic integrity of the red wolf, which is endangered. And we need to protect the genetic integrity and the pure blood of the red wolf and prevent the breeding of coy wolves and red wolves. And I think this really does echo that sort of xenophobic undertone that is present in those other quotes. It's really getting at like the blood poisoning, which I think is, it's a worrisome and problematic. And the thing is that these red wolves and these coyotes, the red wolves, yes, they're endangered. The coyotes are more common, but their offspring are viable and fertile, and they can have their hybrid offspring can have more babies. And theoretically, this hybrid coy wolf could fill the ecological niche that the red wolf, the endangered red wolf, is no longer able to fill because its population is decreasing. So anyway, it's complicated, and I think the xenophobic undertones and the priority of preserving the genetic integrity and the pure blood really undermine the actual ecology that could and the environmental benefit that these coy wolves could contribute. But yeah, I think there's a lot of obviously similarities between the rhetoric used to talk about invasive species and the rhetoric used to talk about immigrants. And there's just this also like a lot of scapegoating. This is why I call my book Scapegoat when I'm talking about invasive species, because I think they're scapegoated. And similarly, I think immigrants are often scapegoated for a variety of issues. And I think bigoted politicians and fear mongers, they'll blame immigrants for economic issues like job shortages, when in reality, oftentimes immigrants moving into the country will bolster the economy, creating businesses, creating more jobs, contributing to taxes in the country. And in fact, the job shortages not caused by immigrants, but are actually caused by foreign policy and economic policy. In the U.S., increased purchasing of Chinese goods, outsourcing production, and an over reliance on technology like industrial robots or now AI to replace human workers. So I think in both cases, invasive species management, and in this particular case, I think agents of the state are quick to blame others for the conditions that they have caused themselves.
We've recently exited a period where we're talking about the purity of blood, or the you know the dangers of race mixing would have been very taboo. Now we're in an era where it's not only not taboo, it's very hard to avoid in your algorithm.
Mhm.
Obviously, you've got Trump, making shocking statements every couple of days. I mean, we could probably spend an hour listing the messed up things that he said about immigrants. But even in Britain, you've got left wing, nominally left wing politicians like Keir Starmer talking about an island of strangers.
Yeah.
Um, that's always been very challenging for me, because I live in a very multicultural area, and I can really see the benefits of living in a multicultural community. I can see it, in my neighborhood, communities interacting in ways that are productive and useful and enjoyable for both sides of the divide.
Mhm.
Um, it's isn't it interesting that these ideas have come back to being things you can say, and isn't it interesting that in the, in the field of ecology,
Mhm.
there hasn't been any questioning of that narrative. It's always been framed in this way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there has been a little questioning to be sure. There, my critique in the discourse that I'm engaging in is, I'm not the first person to talk about it, but no, but it's still like the dominant, prominent way of talking about invasive species. And I think it's also, I don't think, I know it's also true that using this xenophobic rhetoric to talk about invasive species does have the side effect of increasing xenophobia among about people in people. When they're using this language to talk about species, it increases that sort of anti-immigrant or not from here perspective when it comes to people. And so this rhetoric, it's not just problematic in an ecological sense; it is also problematic in a very real social sense as well.
Yeah, no, I find you very convincing on that point, because if you've accepted this framing and this narrative and these terms of reference for one debate, and the other debate is happening simultaneously, it's very easy to reach from one to the other and say, well, this is what we did with the Koya wolves.
Hmm.
Why wouldn't we do this in Portland? You know,
Right.
so yeah, I think your book really hammers that point home quite convincingly. You mentioned this earlier as well. You've proposed in the book a shift in the language.
Hmm.
So you talk about moving the discourse away from managers and invaders to drivers and passengers. If you could kind of unpack this a little bit for us, and tell us what kind of effect you think changing this language might have.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So I talked a little bit about this earlier, but I want to give an example too. So basically, like to reiterate, like drivers and passengers, this is like a new metaphor that can be applied. And I would say, and probably a lot of others would say, and maybe objectively speaking, it is a more accurate metaphor to use when talking about invasive species. And so obviously the invasive species metaphor, real quick, it's militaristic. It has this us versus them mentality. It separates us from nature. It creates a sort of hierarchy, and it's predicated on these sort of capitalist priorities. Whereas the passenger driver metaphor, when used to talk about, what is considered invasive species, really gets at the idea that invasive species are not driving ecological damage or degradation. They are actually arriving in the wake of pre-existing ecological damage or degradation that is instead driven or caused by in most cases, maybe all of them, side effects of capitalist industry and development. And so the example I cite in my book is in California. There's this ecosystem with some invasive grasses, and the grasses love this ecosystem. They're growing a lot, they're taking over, whatever. And they really like this ecosystem because there's a lot of nitrogen in the soil. But the thing is that nitrogen hasn't always been in this soil. The nitrogen came into the soil after they made a highway, and the pollution from the runoff from the highway infiltrated into the dirt, creating more nitrogen, while also decreasing they call it like environmental or ecological or ecosystem resiliency of that ecosystem. And so this created conditions for these invasive grasses to thrive and do well. They are just they're having they're spreading in this ecosystem because of the nitrogen that came because of the highway. And so I think this passenger driver metaphor really helps underscore the fact that the invasive species are not the root cause of these issues by any stretch of the imagination. The root cause is actually capitalist industry and development, capitalism, and capitalist society.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's really interesting. Um, and I like this idea of passengers. That really communicates that point that you're making, that this is stuff that happens sort of in the wake of or directly because of human interactions with that environment. And in a sense as well, it's more of a benign framing, right? Because it's not like saying, all human action, including capitalism, has to cease. It's saying that the capitalist extractivist mode of production and the runoff from that
Mhm,
is what creates the situation
mhm,
where these species become passengers.
mhm,
There's also the positive version of that, where agriculture, or particularly, like you referenced earlier, sort of um, you know native um, societies and their ways of interacting with the land. These had effects on animal populations, but
Mhm,
they didn't really, tend to cause extinctions in the same way. You know,
mhm,
so yeah, no, this is I think a useful development of the language.
mhm.
You also give some examples of the kinds of activist movements that we can look to for inspiration. Um, what do you think they can offer us as examples, and who are some of the kind of movements that you mention in the book?
Yeah, totally. So I like highlight. I kind of go into like some depth with three specific examples: the ZAD in France, Standing Rock in the U.S., and in the Great Plains area, and Cop City in the U.S. In Atlanta. And but there's so many like these. I have a footnote that lists as many similar sort of movements that I could find, just to, if people wanted to brush up or dig in. I made a whole list of them, but I think what the similarities I noticed with all of these are essentially just that these movements recognize that capitalist industry and development are the enemy. They are the number one enemy, and the number one priority and goal should be to preserve and protect land that is threatened by this capitalist industry and development. So yeah, those are those movements, and that is the sort of unifying thread that I'm talking about when I talk about those.
Interesting. I mean, one other thing that struck me when I was reading the book is you do see in, like mainstream media, in films and TV, a lot of narratives that deal with some of the themes that you raise. We're quite used to the sort of like eco-conscious story in mainstream cinema, but that never kind of seems to move the needle very much. Do you think that there's things that like culture producers and people who write books like us could be doing more of, not just to like raise awareness, but to make this land?
Mhm. Yeah, well, and actually, this goes back to your other question. I wanted to add more to that about the passenger driver and like how that language shift or a new story for invasive species might shift perspectives. And I've actually, for a long time as like a storyteller and a writer, I really valued the importance of storytelling and writing to help shift perspective, and the importance of art to change minds and change cultural perspectives. But I think at this point in time, I'm actually more, I really kind of believe that cultural shift and societal shift actually does come first. And to focus and put all the hope in writing and language shifts and new stories is putting the cart before the horse, so to speak. I do think, the passenger driver metaphor is useful and does help to a degree, but I don't think, changing all the language and changing all the metaphors and changing all the stories is going to ultimately push us to a better understanding and a better way of relating to one another and the planet. I think we really do need that societal shift because it's really our actions and our way of living on a day-to-day basis that inform our language and our stories. And we can try to change the stories, but we will still, under a capitalist society, still be facing the same problems and still be engaging in the same sort of relationships that we are now, that are creating problems for one another and for the planet. And so, at the same time, I do think changing stories and language and metaphor and such things can be helpful. I found like a lot of inspiration when I read, certain stories that show a different way of living, a different perspective. I think we are, though, like really encountering so much of that sort of capitalist realism. Capitalism is the only way we can exist post-apocalypse. Like I remember watching Leave the World Behind. I read Leave the World
Mm,
Behind, and then I watched Leave the World Behind, and it just really gets at this like, oh, the apocalypse is happening. Every man for himself. You can't rely on anybody else. They're gonna shoot you, or they're gonna kill you. Everyone's gonna kill each other. And not, I'm gonna spoil it. At the end, they kind of like in the movie, they just like find a bunker in a rich person's house with a TV and movies, and then they just go to this bunker, and then they live in this bunker, and it's just like, I feel like it's just capitalist realism to such a degree that is like so frustrating and annoying. And I think we just encounter these sorts of stories so often in the media, and I do think more stories that explore alternative alternatives beyond capitalism after the apocalypse are really important. There was this it's not fiction, but there's this book called From What Is to What If, and it's not necessarily exactly like totally anti-capitalist, but it's about like other ways we could live on this world that are better for one another and the planet. In the first chapter of this book, I think it's by Rob Hopkins, he talks about like, I wake up today and I go to the community bakery and I've worked there, so I get free bread for the week, and then I pick my children up from school because it was only a 3-day hour of school, and their like work study program is working in the community gardens, and I see my neighbor and I only have to work a few hours a week. Anyway, just paints this like really beautiful picture. I'm not doing it justice at all, but it paints this like really beautiful picture of like what the world could look like and operate in a society that isn't so capitalist. And I don't know. I just think more like I shared that with a local writer who works on a local newspaper because she was trying to inspire people to write and paint pictures of what a post-capitalist society would look like in 40 years or something. And she told me it made her cry, and she was just like really touched by it. So I think more like more stories like that can really inspire what it could really look like and feel like to live in a better world, that are realistic. Like I love the Tea and Monk book series, or the Monk and Robot series, but it's so far in the future that it doesn't really like. It's a lovely like post-capitalist society, and the economy they describe in those books is really interesting, but it's like so far away. And I really like the From What Is to What If, because it seems so reachable and so graspable. So yes, I think on the one hand, I do think like we can only get so far when we change our language and our rhetoric and stories. And I think ultimately it is still cart before the horse sort of stuff, and it's not gonna inspire or create a new world that we need to survive. But at the same time, I think it can really inspire recognition that new worlds are possible, and help I don't know, gain movement and momentum for pushing for post-capitalist societies.
Yeah, that's interesting. That mirrors a story that I read recently. The basically the guys who run one of the big AI companies were saying that the reason AI sometimes comes out with scary things is that it's able to access dystopian fiction, which is, I think the writer Jeff Vandermeer pointed out, is very ironic, because these people have completely misunderstood cyberpunk,
Mm,
pilfered all the ideas from it, as if they thought building the torment nexus was a good idea,
mm,
and now they're saying that it's the fault of the fiction that these robots are behaving as they are.
it's a,
um, but yeah, I think cyberpunk has been so thoroughly misunderstood by sort of billionaire tech bros
mm,
that maybe there is a
mm.
space for some sort of new science, not science fiction, but almost like post-capitalist climate fiction.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are some good examples of that the listeners could give us in the comments there. I'm sure this is a thing that exists, but that I
Yeah.
haven't read it. So,
Please share. I don't read as much sci-fi as I should. The Monk and Robot books I think are a great example of that, but that's like kind of the only example of that I've read. So yeah, if listeners know of other examples, please share.
yeah, they're a bit more scary and horror-y, but
Mm,
the Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer, he's a very
mm,
good writer on climate and science fiction ideas. So yeah, maybe we'll suggest a few more of those in the show notes. Yeah, when I was researching my book, I came across a couple of sort of different schools of like kind of climate crisis focused thought that I thought were very interesting, and that your book struck some similar notes. One is deep ecology,
mm, mhm,
the other one is deep adaptation. Deep ecology comes from Arne Nace, deep
mm,
adaptation from Jem Bendell, and they kind of propose something similar, in that what they're talking about is accepting that a certain number of crises, a certain number of choke points are coming,
Mm,
and that how we learn to live with those needs to be based on the idea that
mm,
all living things have a fundamental worth that's
mhm.
separate from their worth under capitalism. Um, so yeah, I'm not sure if you came across those two guys, but were there any other thinkers that were super influential in the writing of this book? Anybody's ideas that you drew from the well of more than once?
Yeah, well, that particular aspect, I had not heard of deep ecology before, I think last week, and then I listened to a podcast about it, and I was like, "Oh my god, I wish I had known about this when I was writing my book because this is so relevant and really getting at that, people are not separate, from nature." And yeah, I think, I really appreciated, there was this like one study. I write about a lot of different forms of indigenous land stewardship in my book, and there was this one particular study that I really appreciated, which is it surveys members of the Anishinaabe tribe on their ideas around invasive species, and it's just such a beautiful like different non-dominant like perspective around invasive species. There's just these ideas that a lot of people who were interviewed definitely did think like invasive species pose a threat to the environment. I think we're not, that is true and real, and I think that is legitimate. But there was so much compassion and recognition, like you're saying, that all beings on this planet have a right to live and should be respected, and I think that was like the sort of I don't know, foundational like aspect of the ecology that these people interviewed in this study performed, and it showed up a lot when talking about invasive species. And there was like far more concern about like an invasive land ethic and the threats that an invasive land ethic has to ecosystems and the planet. And obviously this invasive land ethic is capitalism, right? A capitalist perspective of the world that it has formed like command and control forms of environmental stewardship, and is predicated on borders and private property, and enforces this separation between people and planet. And they were far more concerned about how that has negative consequences on the environment than invasive species. And there was so much compassion for invasive species. One person was like, "I just feel bad for them. They just were brought here. They don't know they're invasive. They're just trying to survive." And I just thought that was beautiful. So I think the people who were involved in that study, Nick Rio and Laura Ogden. And Nick Rio is actually in Anishinaabe. I really, really valued their perspectives and bringing that study to light. I also, Uwe Porksen is obviously another thinker that I rely a lot on, and am very grateful to his contribution to theories of language and semiotics with his work on plastic words. And then Mark Davis is he was one of the main guys who is critiquing from an ecological standpoint our perspective on invasive species and invasion ecology. Obviously Mark's too. And then my partner, Pete, he has been there for me for much of the writing of this book. And he's definitely a thinker. I have bounced a lot of ideas off and has really helped me formulate many of the arguments in my book. So got to do a shout out to him too.
Excellent, excellent. Well, listen, I really enjoyed chatting to you about this, and like I say, the book is a fascinating read, and I think part of a growing body of work that it is from people like yourself who are trying to think of alternatives, think of different ways of framing things, different stories we can tell, and I think that's really important work. Before I let you go, you mentioned that you're working on another book. Can you tell us anything about it?
Yeah, this book, as that picture of the house with the nature around it might indicate, this book is about homes, and it's about the idea of the capitalist home, the home embedded in capitalist mythology, and the ways in which our capitalist homes are haunted by side effects of extraction and exploitation of people and planet that bring our appliances and our possessions and our property into our homes, and is also predicated on this idea of separation between people and people and planet, and gets at other ideas we can make home in a world in crisis. That's kind of what I'm working on next.
Brilliant. All right, that sounds like another fascinating read. I'll be looking forward to picking that one up. And yeah, no, thank you again for a fascinating conversation. So you've been listening to Strange Exiles, a podcast about ideas, identity, and ideology, hosted and produced by me, Bram E. Gieben. My guest today was author and environmentalist Clare Follmann. You can find out more about Clare's work at her website, clarefollmann.com. Here's the little illustration we were looking at earlier, which is also Clare's work. You've got some links to her other writing there and some of her other work in various fields, including academic fields. And if you want to get yourself a copy of Scapegoat, What the Invasive Species Story Gets Wrong, what you should do is visit akpress.org and you'll find it there. It's also available in all good bookshops. So that's us for today. Clare, thank you very much for joining us. And yeah, I hope you have a nice rest of your day. And yeah, thank you for a brilliant conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was really fun. Hope you have a great day.